bienvenue à notre rendez-vous quotidien pour la presse en ligne et en direct sur EBS. Nous sommes aujourd'hui le jeudi 18 février. Nous avons seulement 2 annonces courtes pour vous aujourd'hui. Tout d'abord, nous publions le paquet d'infractions du mois de février. Comme vous le savez, pour aider les citoyens et les entreprises à pleinement profiter du marché intérieur, la Commission est en dialogue permanent avec les États membres qui ne respectent pas le droit européen et, au besoin, ouvre des procédures d'infraction à leur égard. Les décisions prises aujourd'hui comprennent 41 lettres de mise en demeure, 40 avis motivés et 4 renvois à la Cour de justice de l'Union européenne. Nous clôturons également 100 dossiers en cours. Vous trouvez un résumé des principales décisions en ligne et dans notre Daily News. And secondly, let me remind you that Executive Vice President Valdis Dombrovskis will come to the press room at 12:45 to present the trade policy review, which was adopted yesterday by the College, which means that we will limit this briefing to a maximum of 45 minutes, or 40 minutes, actually. And with this, we are ready for your questions, and I pass the floor to Oliver.
Hello. So since we don't have too much time, I'll be quick. Could we please have President von der Leyen's reaction to the continued and increasing attacks of the Slovenian Prime Minister, who is, by the way, also a member of her political party, the European People's Party. So his attacks not only on Brussels correspondents, but also on journalists in Slovenia, particularly on female journalists. Thank you. And a personal question to you, Eric. Can you give us the reasoning behind not putting this very question to President von der Leyen yesterday when I wrote it in the chats that we have here, where we can announce questions we want to ask? Why wasn't she allowed to answer this question herself?
Oliver, I'm certainly not going to discuss here in the press room with you press arrangements on press conferences. The rules are absolutely clear. The practice is very clear. There is an enormous amount of questions. I select a certain number of journalists, not based on what's written in the chat. I don't look at the chat. I look at hands raised, and journalists can then ask the question that they wish. I only look at the chat if a journalist who has raised his or her hand cannot actually ask the question. So let me make that very clear. We had an hour and a half of questions, and therefore it was perfectly possible for anyone to ask that question to the President. All right? Now, that being said, I pass the floor to Christian on this issue.
Yeah, I think we have a very clear reply to your question. We work with you in this press room every day, so I think we are well placed to know very well the professionalism and dedication of the Brussels Press Corps. This is, of course, also true for Lily Bayer, Martina Stevis, and some other colleagues that were mentioned here in this context. Let me also remind you of what Vice President Jourova said almost a year ago in the context of attacks against journalists in Slovenia. I quote, "Free and independent media are key for democracies and EU values. Their job is to hold us, politicians, into account. The protection of journalists should be a priority for every country. No hate, no threats, no personal attacks." These words remain valid also today.
And since you asked for the President's reaction, I can say that he, of course, fully endorses this response. Oliver, you have a follow-up.
Thank you. The protection of journalists apparently is not a priority to at least Mr. Janša in Slovenia, to Mr. Orban in Hungary, and also to the Polish government. I'm old enough to have been around when the European Commission dropped the ball vis-à-vis Mr. Orban when he dismantled media freedom there a decade ago. I remember when the Polish government, the current Polish government, started doing the same thing several years ago, and now I'm sadly watching the same thing happening over again in Slovenia. How do you measure the efficacy of your efforts and of your admonitions? Is it enough to simply say that we treasure your work and you shouldn't be mean to journalists, or is there anything else you can do beyond that? Because the kind of treatment we as privileged EU correspondents get here in Brussels is nothing compared to what journalists, and especially female journalists, get in Slovenia, in Hungary, and in Poland. It's much, much worse. So we're just the tip of the iceberg. What do you do concretely? Thank you.
Christian.
Thank you, Oliver. Well, look, we have already shared our concerns about the situation in Slovenia and also about in some other member states, as you know, particularly in the rule of law report. The latest rule of law report for Slovenia notes that online harassment or threats against journalists are frequent and often not sanctioned. Of course, it is not just about the report. You know that we are engaging with all member states on the matter and on the basis of the report and in the framework of this rule of law mechanism with the annual reports and dialogues with the member states. So we are doing that, and we will continue to do that, particularly also with view to preparing the next rule of law report this year. And to give you even more concrete hints of what is in preparation, because we are really stepping up the work, I think, in this area on the protection of journalists and also on media freedom and pluralism more generally. I can point you, for instance, to the European Democracy Action Plan, where we outlined that we take all threats against journalists very seriously and will propose specific recommendations on the safety of journalists later this year.
Thank you. Let us remain on rule of law issues and on media freedom. So please keep your hand raised only if it is on this issue. I pass the floor to Tamar.
This opportunity, and excuse me, it's not regarding to the media freedom. It's regard this issue about Georgia. As we know, on 16th of March there will be Georgia European Association Council.
Tamar, I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry. You have to let me try to organize the debates here in the press room. We are currently on the rule of law issues, so we will come back to other issues at a further point in time. We take note, of course, of your wish to ask a question. Apologies for that, but in view of time, I will move on. So, questions for Christian on rule of law, media freedom. ATHANASIOS.
Thanks very much. We'll continue from something that Christian said. Christian, you said that there are threats that are not sanctioned. So this means that the national authorities are not doing their job. I mean, the judiciary and the police, and I don't know who else. When they're not doing their job at the national level, then I suppose it's your job to do your job at the European level. So are you planning, preparing, or on the process of an infringement against this country for the treatment of these cases? Not the harassment of journalists as such, but the fact that they're not following up on these cases. And there are many others. You know, it's not only specific to this country that the authorities tend to disregard threats, harassment, and bullying in the Twittersphere or in the internet in general towards the press. And we've seen the results personally and as press corps in Greece in similar situations back in the previous decade. So I'll be back with the specific issue. Are you planning, processing, or in the process of an infringement towards those who don't do their job at the national level? Thanks. Christian.
Look, first of all, I would like to point back to what I just said. Sorry, I have clearly too many papers by now. On what I just said on an upcoming initiative on specific recommendations on the safety of journalists this year. So this is part of ongoing work in the framework of the European Democracy action plan. So this is clearly an important strand of work. It's a bit difficult to, in a very general manner, now reply to the question of whether we would come with infringement on this or that situation. Clearly, first of all, there's the framework of the rule of law report, where we are raising different matters, and of course, different elements. Media freedom is one important one, but also the functioning of the justice systems, etc. And there is a dialogue on this with member states, because as you know, in the area of justice, it is not possible for the Commission in all instances to intervene. I mean, criminal law is to a large extent, for instance, still a national competence. However, what I would like to point you to as well, and in more general terms, but as I said, I'm not entirely sure which specific cases you now have in mind, but just today we have a couple of more infringements coming out, as you will see in our infringements cases on the framework decision on combating racism and xenophobia, where we are taking a couple of more decisions today towards a number of member states. So there is some legislation in place which is referring, for instance, to illegal hate speech, which needs to be criminalized under national law. So there are angles where the Commission has a competence, and where we do have competence, as always, we are also, of course, following up.
Thank you, Christian. We stay on this issue. David.
Très rapide, parce que je n'ai pas entendu le mot. Est-ce que vous condamniez ou pas le comportement du Premier ministre slovénien?
On va te répéter la réponse alors, Christian.
Je pense que j'étais extrêmement clair. No hate, no threats, no personal attacks.
Et la présidente soutient ceci. Vous savez à quel point elle est attachée à la liberté d'expression des médias et à la liberté et la sécurité des journalistes, y compris évidemment dans l'exercice de leur fonction. Maria.
Oui, bonjour. Merci beaucoup. Bon, tout d'abord, je me demande si c'est possible d'avoir une réponse par oui ou non. Vous condamnez, oui ou non, les propos du Premier ministre slovène. Ensuite, j'ai des questions un peu plus concrètes. Je voudrais savoir quelles sont les compétences de la Commission européenne pour agir dans la défense de la liberté et le pluralisme des médias. Est-ce que, par exemple, le mécanisme de conditionnalité sur l'état de droit peut intervenir en ce qui concerne la défense du pluralisme des médias. Et ensuite, j'aurais une question sur la Hongrie et l'action qui a été lancée aujourd'hui, mais je ne sais pas si vous préférez qu'on attende de passer à ce sujet-là.
La question sur la Hongrie sera aussi pour Christian, je pense, donc il va pouvoir répondre aux deux questions. Vas-y.
Ok. Alors, concernant les compétences, bien sûr, c'est important de rappeler la compétence dans le domaine du pluralisme et des médias et la responsabilité. C'est premièrement la responsabilité des États membres d'assurer la sécurité des journalistes et la protection des journalistes. Et ça sépare de nos efforts dans le dialogue avec les États membres d'assurer ça. Mais il ne faut pas oublier que c'est premièrement la responsabilité des États membres et des autorités nationales to live up to their responsibility. Et par ça, je pense, j'ai déjà dit ce que je peux dire concernant nos initiatives et concernant le mécanisme d'état de droit où nous avons pour la première fois l'année passée aussi inclus cet élément de liberté des médias et le pluralisme, et ça va être très important part très important aussi du prochain rapport sur l'état des droits dans tous les États membres.
Christian.
C'est qu'effectivement, vous êtes le... Tu me vois?
Oui, mais
tu m'entends?
On n'a pas entendu le début de ta question. Il faut que tu recommences. Et
alors, je veux...
Vas-y.
Je voulais dire que je suis désolé d'insister, mais effectivement, comme tu me l'avais fait remarquer il y a quelques jours, ce Mid-Day, en fait, s'adresse, c'est le seul point de presse que nous ayons pour l'ensemble des institutions. Alors, je veux bien comprendre que la Commission soit embarrassée, mais le message, il vaut pour tous les représentants de toutes les institutions aujourd'hui. On a un Premier ministre qui, dans quelques mois, va assumer la présidence semestrielle de l'Union européenne, qui aujourd'hui, ouvertement, puisqu'il utilise un réseau social, est en train de critiquer à la fois des journalistes de Bruxelles, les journalistes de son pays. Donc je voudrais savoir, ma première question, c'est comment est-ce qu'on peut ouvrir une procédure d'infraction? Quels sont les délais pour ce genre d'attaque contre les valeurs de l'Union européenne? Est-ce qu'on peut faire ça vite? Pas vite. Ma deuxième question, c'est quelle est la crédibilité de l'Union européenne? Excusez-moi, mais en fait, on est en train de se gargariser des valeurs de l'Union européenne et on n'est même pas capable de condamner des attaques outrancières.
Ce n'est pas nous qui t'avons coupé la parole, que les choses soient absolument claires. Mais permets-moi d'abord aussi de répondre à Marie avant. Peut-être que nous n'avons pas été suffisamment clairs. Oui, bien sûr, nous n'acceptons pas et nous condamnons des propos injurieux à l'égard de journalistes, et dans ce cas précis, y compris dans ce cas précis, que les choses soient absolument claires. Deuxièmement, on ne lance pas une procédure d'infraction, à ma connaissance, contre un tweet, Christian. Ce qui n'enlève pas, évidemment, à la pertinence de la question sur l'action de la Commission par rapport au cadre juridique dans lequel peut s'exercer le métier de journaliste dans tel ou tel pays. Mais nous ne pouvons pas simplement lancer une procédure d'infraction par rapport à une insulte personnelle ou un commentaire personnel de qui que ce soit contre un journaliste. Je crois que là-dessus, la situation est claire. Comme tu le sais, les procédures d'infraction, c'est par rapport à la législation qui est en place dans un État membre au regard du droit de l'Union européenne. Donc il faut distinguer un petit peu les choses. Deuxièmement, nous avons ensuite d'autres moyens d'action. Par exemple, le rapport sur l'état de droit dans l'Union qu'a mentionné Christian dans sa réponse permanente, qui est pour nous une base pour évaluer la situation dans les États et mener un dialogue avec les États membres. Ensuite, nous avons le plan d'action pour la démocratie que nous avons annoncé et dans le cadre duquel, en 2021, donc cette année, nous reviendrons avec des propositions spécifiques pour défendre l'exercice du métier de journaliste dans les États membres et notamment protéger les journalistes par rapport à des procédures judiciaires abusives. Donc je pense qu'il y a tout un corpus de choses qui sont à la disposition de l'Union européenne, que nous avons annoncé, que nous allons proposer, mais il ne faut pas confondre d'une part ce que nous pouvons faire sur un incident isolé dans un tweet, et de l'autre, ce que nous pouvons faire dans le cadre d'une procédure d'infraction. Voilà ce que je voulais dire. Je rajouterai par ailleurs, je ne sais pas si Johannes est avec nous, mais que, bien entendu, il y a aussi la responsabilité, comme tu le sais, des acteurs du numérique, des réseaux sociaux, et leur responsabilité dans le cadre de la surveillance des propos qui sont tenus sur leur réseau. Donc il y a tout un ensemble d'acteurs qui sont impliqués. Je passe la parole à Alexander. Alexander. Alexander.
Wonderful, thank you. So first I would like to preface with an observation that I feel that the question by my dear colleague Oliver Grimm on Ursula von der Leyen's personal direct response has not been fully answered, but I will go ahead with a more detailed question. So alongside the Democracy Action Plan, the Commission announced some help for news media through the news initiative, which was also announced in early December. And within that, the Commission promised credit help, credit facilities through InvestEU for news media, and also direct grants to news media through Creative Europe. And I was wondering, I mean, the criteria for this financial aid to news media has not been published, not been released by the Commission yet, but I was wondering whether, you know, how that will affect public service media in Slovenia or Hungary. I mean, if Slovenia is allowed to gut its public service media the way that Hungary and Poland have done, I mean, will the Commission then at least say in the criteria that these news media that have been you know, kind of robbed of their independence will not receive money from the Commission to produce government propaganda? I would very much like your response on that.
Thank you. On the first part of your question, apologies if we have not been clear enough. I think our reaction and that of President von der Leyen is very clear. We condemn any insults or attacks on journalists. We would not dream of doing it here in Brussels, and we certainly do not expect others to indulge in those sorts of practices. Let there be absolutely no doubt about that. That is, however, a different question from the one of the means that are at our disposal to ensure the protection of the work of the media. And this is why, in my previous answer to Christian, I was trying to set out those differences and the tools that are at our disposal. On the other question, I pass the floor to Christian.
Yeah, I can maybe add a few points here. First in general, maybe just to be clear once more again, as we have tried to explain, I think we have really stepped up our action to ensure that media freedom is guaranteed everywhere in the EU. And there are three main strands here, and you're bringing in the third one now, actually. So the first one were questions about legal safeguards and upcoming initiatives in that respect, especially on the safety of journalists. Then the monitoring of the situation in the context of the rule of law mechanism and the dialogue with the member states. And then the third strand is, of course, money and EU funds, where we provide funding for journalists or media, especially during the pandemic. And there we have actually put forward, indeed, a number of economic measures. First of all, to support member states in general, as you know, in the pandemic. And we encourage them to make the most of those measures, including for the media sector. I can just name a few of them. Financial support to accompany industry and especially SMEs. Then, of course, in the framework of the state aids temporary framework, the Commission allows member states to provide grants, subsidies, loans, and guarantees. Also, of course, sure, the short-term work schemes is also applicable. And then, of course, we have instruments that cover news media sector specifically. For instance, the Cultural and Creative Sectors Guarantee Facility offers loans, and also the cultural. No, sorry, that's the same. Okay, so there's a number of instruments at disposal. I must say I don't have now the detailed information here with me. We would have to check this with our experts on the exact eligibility criteria. In this case, but of course, as you know, the Commission always ensures that our funds are being used properly, and we ensure compliance with the applicable rules.
Okay, thanks. Let me also pass the floor to Johannes, and then I'll give the floor again to Arianna on the state aid angle. Johannes.
Thank you, Eric. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Thanks. No, just briefly. So the calls are not launched yet, and the conditions are not published yet on the initiative that Alexander Fanta was referring to, which was launched in the framework of the Media and Audiovisual Action Plan. but it is clear already that we will, of course, make sure that the editorial independence of the beneficiaries is guaranteed of this measure. And here the measure is really, or will be, aimed at supporting news media that were suffering quite heavily during the crisis, and make sure they can get support. But as I said, editorial independence is a criterion, and also business viability, but not any editorial line or anything else. But this I can already say. But happy to check where we stand and when we can announce more details.
Thank you. And I will pass the floor again to Arianna to remind us about what she had said on the issue of state aid for the Slovenian press agency.
Indeed. What I can remind you of is that in general, state aid rules enable member states to grant aid to media and to press agencies as compensation for services of general economic interest. The choice of granting aid is always a policy decision of member states, but of course, European rules cannot serve as an excuse to stop funding to media or press agencies specifically.
Thank you very much. We continue on the issue. Quentin.
Bonjour Eric, excusez-moi, tu m'entends?
Vas-y.
Super. Oui, excuse-moi, j'ai eu un petit problème technique avec mon ordinateur. Juste pour revenir sur l'histoire avec la présidente, est-ce que on peut s'attendre, vu qu'il y a un sommet la semaine prochaine, que la présidente de la Commission va avoir une discussion bilatérale avec le Premier ministre slovène pour parler de son traitement de la presse et de la presse bruxelloise, ou est-ce que finalement rien du tout? Merci.
Merci Quentin. Je te rappelle que la réunion, enfin en tout cas à ma connaissance, la réunion qui aura lieu la semaine prochaine, c'est une réunion par visioconférence à laquelle participent l'ensemble des chefs d'État et de gouvernement, avec un ordre du jour qui est fixé par le président du Conseil européen. Donc je ne pense pas que ce soit le genre de format qui permette des discussions en aparté, quelles qu'elles soient. Je passe la parole à Maria. Tu es de nouveau... Pardon, Quentin, tu as un follow-up.
Pardon, excuse-moi. Donc en fait, il n'y a aucun contact entre la présidente de la Commission et le Premier ministre slovène sur la question de l'harcèlement des journalistes de la presse européenne.
Mais Quentin, comme je l'ai dit, je crois qu'il faut quand même faire la distinction entre différentes choses. Nous venons de condamner des propos tenus dans le cadre d'un tweet. Une autre chose, c'est l'action structurelle de la Commission par rapport à la liberté des médias dans les États membres de l'Union européenne, y compris en Slovénie. Ces outils sont les outils institutionnels que nous mettons en œuvre. Et c'est ça la base de notre action. Maria. Maria, tu as redemandé la parole.
Vous m'entendez?
Oui.
Oui, bonjour, merci. Juste, je n'avais pas compris la réponse à ma question. Donc, est-ce qu'un État membre qui ne respecte pas la pluralité des médias ou qui même utilise des fonds européens pour bafouer la pluralité des médias peut-il se voir privé d'accès aux fonds de l'Union européenne en vertu du mécanisme de conditionnalité qui a été adopté fin décembre? Et je me permets aussi du coup de poser ma question concernant donc la Hongrie. Donc si j'ai bien compris, la Commission lance aujourd'hui une procédure envers la Hongrie qui n'a pas respecté la décision de la Cour de justice de l'Union européenne sur la loi sur le financement des ONG. Je voulais savoir à quel point est-ce que vous estimez que les dommages qui ont été causés par cette loi peuvent être réparables, sachant qu'elle est en place depuis 2017. Merci beaucoup.
Christian. On the second one, on the first one, it's for Bob.
Yes. Oui. Oui, en fait, la Commission a envoyé aujourd'hui une lettre de mise en demeure à la Hongrie pour le non-respect de l'arrêt de la Cour de justice de l'Union européenne relatif à la loi hongroise sur les ONG. Les arrêts de la Cour de justice constatant qu'un État membre a manqué une des obligations qui lui incombe en vertu des traités lie immédiatement à l'État membre concerné. cet État membre est tenu de prendre sans retard toutes les mesures nécessaires pour se conformer à la décision. À ce jour, la Hongrie n'a pas pris les mesures nécessaires pour se conformer à l'arrêt de la Cour. La Hongrie a jusqu'au 18 avril pour répondre et informer la Commission des mesures prises pour l'exécuter l'arrêt. À défaut, la Commission pourrait décider de saisir la Cour de justice pour demander le paiement des sanctions financières à l'Hongrie. What I could add on your more specific question, I mean, the Commission, I think, has done its job. We have launched an infringement. We have won this case before the European Court of Justice, and now we are ensuring that it is also respected. I can remind you of the fact that we, of course, have also been in contact with Hungary after the judgments. There were actually 2 letters sent to Hungary asking for clarifications and for reassuring us that the judgment would be implemented. And as this has finally still not led to the necessary result and the full implementation of the judgment, we have now today launched this process. This is an infringement procedure under Article 260, meaning that you have a letter of formal notice, then the member state has a chance to reply and give explanations, and after that we would propose sanctions to the Court of Justice.
Thank you. We keep your question, Maria. We will come back to it. I want to see if there are other questions for Christian here. Naomi, or is it not for Christian? Okay. Petra. Go ahead, Petra.
The issue of the Slovenian News Agency. Arianna, could you please tell us whether the Slovenian authorities have withdrawn the notification or not? Thank you.
Well, that was not for Christian, but Arianna will answer nevertheless. Go ahead.
Is it okay? Okay, sorry. So what I can say is that following the notification of the aid measure by the Slovenian authorities on 7th January this year, we have advised the Slovenian authorities that member states are entitled under the so-called Services of General Economic Interest decision to grant public service aid without prior notification to the Commission, provided that the condition of these rules are fulfilled and the annual aid amount is not higher than 15 million euros, like it is indeed in the case of the Slovenian press agencies. These rules apply also to the public service of a news agency, and it is a responsibility of the member state to make sure that the conditions are met. We remain in contact with the Slovenian authorities on this matter. I do not have information on the fact that the notification has been withdrawn, so I believe that we still have the notification with us. If, despite what I have just said, the Slovenian authorities insist on receiving a Commission decision, we will assess it as a matter of priority as soon as the Slovenian authorities send us complete information on this measure.
Thank you. Now we'll come to the question that Maria had on the rule of law mechanism, if we're in a position to answer now. And I give the floor to Balázs. Thank you, Christian.
Bonjour. Donc justement une petite précision par rapport à la question que vous me posez. Donc le règlement auquel vous faites référence est entré en vigueur le 1er janvier et le but du règlement très simplement c'est de protéger les intérêts financiers de l'Union européenne et le budget de l'Union européenne de manière générale. Et donc voilà, c'est le but. Et la Commission est en train d'élaborer un certain nombre de guidelines dont le but sera de permettre l'opéralisation pratique du règlement. Donc c'est ça où on est maintenant avec ce règlement.
Merci Balázs, mais je crois que la question qui se pose à nous, c'est de savoir dans quelle mesure le non-respect, qu'on va dire théorique, mais appliqué en pratique dans un État membre de la liberté d'expression des médias peut être un des critères pris en compte dans la mise en œuvre du mécanisme. Je pense, Maria, que nous reviendrons vers toi plus spécifiquement sur ces questions, en sachant, comme vient le dire Balázs, que le travail de définition exactement des orientations qui vont guider la mise en œuvre de ce mécanisme est actuellement en cours. Il est évident qu'il sert, l'objectif de ce mécanisme, c'est de protéger les intérêts financiers de l'Union européenne et que donc il faut qu'il puisse y avoir un lien entre le mécanisme et le budget. Mais sur le fait de savoir si les questions liées à la liberté d'exercice des médias fait partie des critères, nous reviendrons vers toi. Merci. Je clôt ce chapitre et je passe maintenant la parole à Tamar, qui avait demandé la parole dès le début. Tamar, you have the floor. Tamar seems to have left us, so I pass the floor to... Ah no, here she is. Tamar, go ahead, please.
Of March, there will be Georgia European Union's Council meeting. Also, President of European Council has intention to visit Georgia and Ukraine in March. But in another hand, today, Georgia's Prime Minister, Giorgi Gakharia, has resigned regarding a court decision to arrest the leader of the largest opposition party, Nick Amelia. So how do you estimate this situation?
Go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon, Tamar, and thank you very much. Of course, we are following very closely the situation and the developing situation in Georgia. We are deeply concerned about the continued polarization in the country, which is further exacerbated by the court ruling against Mr. Melia. The only way forward now is by reducing tensions and engage in political dialogue. This is in the best interest of the country and this is in the best interest of citizens of Georgia. We call on all sides in Georgia to exercise restraint and act responsibly in order to overcome the current political crisis. What is also important to mention is that the current political impasse and continued polarization can only serve those who seek to undermine Georgia's stability, and it also can only damage Georgia's international reputation. And political stability and inclusive parliamentary process are important preconditions not only to deal with the consequences of the coronavirus pandemic, but also for bringing about further reforms and deepening cooperation between European Union and Georgia.
Thank you. Let us stay on foreign affairs issues for the couple of minutes that we have left. So please don't keep your hand raised if it is on foreign affairs. Thomas.
Oui, merci Eric. C'est juste pour savoir, après 7 heures de discussion avec les Suisses, si vous êtes plus ou moins optimiste sur les possibilités d'avoir un accord cadre. Et comme on a toujours dit qu'il ne faut pas éterniser cette discussion, ça c'est votre position, est-ce qu'on a droit encore plus ou moins à combien de séances? Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Thomas. Il n'y a pas un droit à un certain nombre de séances. C'est évidemment pas du tout comme cela que ça marche. Tu sais que les autorités suisses ont évoqué un certain nombre de sujets sur lesquels ils souhaitent des clarifications. concernant l'accord cadre institutionnel. Les discussions sont en cours. Madame Loy a annoncé qu'elle avait l'intention d'avoir en tout cas une prochaine session avec la Commission européenne, et je peux te confirmer que c'est aussi notre intention. Maintenant, te dire exactement combien de temps cela va durer ne m'est pas possible. Nous n'avons pas fixé une date limite, mais nous avons aussi clairement dit et répété à de très très nombreuses reprises qu'il s'agissait de clarifications, qu'a priori donc des clarifications, cela doit pouvoir se fournir rapidement, et que nous nous attendons à ce que le Conseil fédéral suisse prenne les mesures nécessaires pour signer et envoyer vers la ratification sans délai l'accord institutionnel cadre. Voilà le contexte dans lequel nous nous trouvons à l'heure actuelle. Donc pas de timing bien spécifique, mais il est clair que ce n'est pas une renégociation et que donc cela doit aller vite. Are there other questions for us on external affairs today? Please only keep your hand raised if it is on this. Naomi.
Thanks for taking my question. It's about the destruction of some structures by Israel in Gaza, which were paid for by EU aid from a number of member states under an EU umbrella. My question is whether the Commission would support asking for compensation for the value of the what was destroyed that was paid for with EU aid money. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter, can you answer that question?
Yes, and happy if there is follow-up from the colleagues. But Naomi, thank you for this question. This is an issue that comes back frequently recently. I think last week we issued a statement on the recent demolitions of the Palestinian structures, including some which were financed indeed with EU money and money provided by the member states. This is an issue which is constantly on our agenda when we deal with our partners in Israel. We keep raising this issue. The demolitions as such, they are unacceptable. I mean, we are urging Israeli authorities to stop it, to reverse it. It goes into the broader picture of steps taken in order to complicate the resumption of the negotiated two-state solution, or negotiations that should ideally lead to the two-state solution. So this is a subject of our continued attention, and this is something that is being raised with the Israeli partners and within the EU, of course.
We'll take one last question from Vlad, and then we move to the press conference. Vlad, you have the floor.
Second. So Peter, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
There for a second.
Yes, go ahead.
Yep, thank you. So just going back to Georgia for a second. So Peter, you mentioned that the only way forward is dialogue. The European Union has so far played a role in negotiating some of these political agreements in Georgia. Does the EU stand ready to help with this ongoing dialogue? This is one question. And then the second one, the opposition has already called for snap elections. How does the EU assess another potentially turbulent election cycle in Georgia? Thank you.
Thanks, Vlad. For the sake of the time, the second question I think I tackled in my previous answer about what we expect in terms of dialogue and engagement and inclusive parliamentary process. On the first one, of course, Georgia is a valued partner for the European Union. We stand by Georgia and its people, and we are ready and happy to continue our assistance and help provided to Georgia in whatever way it might be deemed useful by our Georgian partners.
Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of today's midday briefing, and we leave the press room for Executive Vice President Dombrovskis on the trade review. Thank you.